This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Chthonia. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Today's topic is going to be a Greek figure, alleged Greek mythological figure known as Baubo. Now, Baubo, the story of Baubo, at least as has been told, is that there's a myth of her that appears in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, as she who perpetrates some kind of a obscene spectacle for the goddess Demeter when she is in her search for Persephone. The backdrop of the Persephone story, I'm sure most people who listen to this probably know it. I do have a podcast on Persephone. But the story is basically that, she is, in the field picking flowers. She's there with her mother, and that the god Hades sees her, falls in love with her, because Aphrodite has Eros shoot him with an arrow, and the first woman he sees is Persephone, and he's in love. And he asks Zeus if he can have her, and Zeus says sure, because Zeus is apparently her father or uncle. There's this kind of whole interesting dynamic there as to who Persephone is. It seems that she's a daughter of Zeus and Demeter, and so she's right on the edge of womanhood, or right at the beginning of womanhood. Hades comes and carries her off. Her mother, who's had her back turned, does not see. And this scene is either known as like the abduction of Persephone or the rape of Persephone. And, she ends up being taken to the underworld. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole discussion of why this does not, have to do with the R word in the sense that we traditionally think of it, although that often is the way it's been interpreted socially and otherwise. And again, that's covered entirely in the other podcast that I have. But Persephone is okay. But in this search for Persephone, Demeter is, of course, in mourning. She's very upset. She's lost her daughter, doesn't know where she is, and she starts this wandering. She ends up in the town of Eleusis, which, if you know anything about Demeter, you know that is one of the towns associated with her mystery cult, the cult of Eleusis, which is connected to the Orphics, and to Orphism. Okay. So, in the hymn to Demeter, what actually happens is now the thing is, okay, what happens in this hymn, we attribute this to Baubo, but the name actually given is Iambe, who is a maiden, and says to her, she cheers up the goddess, says that she uses dirty jokes, and that this makes the goddess who's refused she was offered a drink and she's refused it. So she supposedly makes these dirty jokes up, and and Demeter laughs, and then she kind of relaxes, and she breaks her fast, and she accepts the food, and so forth. And she comes out of her mourning. And it's this is so in this Iambe, who has been conflated with Baubo here, is often considered to be like an old nursemaid or something. Now in other versions, where we start to associate Iambe of Homer with Baubo is in Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius in particular. Both talk about what the version that's told there is that Baubo doesn't, Baubo is there instead of Iambe, and she comforts Demeter not through making dirty jokes, but rather by lifting her gown up to reveal her genitals. And this indecency provokes laughter in Demeter, who then accepts the food and drink. Okay. There is let me see if I can find this. There's actually, yes, here we go. This is the excerpt from Clement of Alexandria's exhortation to the Greeks. It says, Baubo, having received Demeter as a guest, offers her a draught of wine and meal. She declines to take it, being unwilling to drink on account of her mourning. Baubo is deeply hurt, thinking she has been slighted, and thereupon uncovers her secret parts and exhibits them to the goddess. Demeter is pleased at the sight, and now at least receives the draught. Delighted by the spectacle, And he says, "These are the secret mysteries of the Athenians. These are also the subjects of Orpheus's poems. I will quote you the very lines of Orpheus, that you may have the originator of the mysteries as witness of their shamelessness." This said, she drew aside her robes, showed a sign of shame. Child Iacchus was there, and laughing plunged his hand below her breasts. Then smiled the goddess, and her heart smiled, and drank the draught from the glancing cup. Okay, so what we're seeing here is this idea of Baubo being, in this case, in the case of Clement of Alexandria, he's actually saying that Iambe, as mentioned in the Homeric hymn, and he cites the Orphics as being the source. Now, if you study mythology, you know that there's different variations of Greek myth. We tend to think of Greek mythology as somehow, being in one nice, neat volume that, was found somewhere or was written on a scroll or something like that. That's not how it is. Greek mythology has been pieced together from so many different places, and often only from fragments. Okay, there's a lot of room for variation and interpretation in these myths. And it seems that when we're talking about, this particular, when we talk about the Orphics versus what we might think of as, what we've tended to view as traditional Greek sources, which again, we don't, I think using the word traditional might be, I think people could challenge me on using that word, let's put it that way. But in any case, it's the version that we've come to understand as the version from the sources that we know. The Orphic version always tends to differ slightly, just as in the Dionysus podcast, I talked about the difference between, the Orphic story of Dionysus, in which his parents are Zeus and Persephone, and the story that we're more familiar with, where he is the son of Zeus and Semele. So, and the two stories have very different inflections and implications. Now, in the Orphic story, this Iambe, who is part of this, who they meet, this nursemaid they meet at Eleusis, in the house of the king and queen. She is, it seems that, being that the Orphic rites are very much connected to these mysteries of Eleusis, this mystery of, Persephone going into the underworld and being sought by her mother and then later reunited with her mother, as this kind of motif having to do with death, with encountering the underworld, and also, honestly, also Persephone and what she represents in terms of adolescence or what it means to move from childhood to womanhood is a big part of this. But as far as it was used in the mysteries, and to be clear, we don't know enough about the Orphic mystery rites. We don't know everything that happened there. We glean certain things from certain sources. Certain things are referred to where we might, get sort of a vague idea. But the bottom line is that we don't actually know what was done there. I mean, what the mysteries are. And actually, just like this one, and this is part of the problem, the only sources that we have are the early church fathers. Okay, and of course, as we know, just as we talk about with a lot of Irish mythology, when you have what we'll call the opposing religion, writing your mythology, it's obviously going to have a very different tone and inflection. Okay, so there's so these are the sources that we have for what we think of now as the Baubo myth. Now let's throw another wrinkle into this. So back in the date is listed as 1989. There's a place called it was a excavation of something at I don't know if you say this Prine or Prine, but it's in modern day Turkey. It's Priene. I did not look up the pronunciation ahead of time, so I'm not sure which way it is. But there was a hall of these female figures that were found, and it's the face of the female is placed directly onto their torso, and it gives the impression that the vulva and the chin merge with each other. So now this is the archaeologists who uncovered these decided that they depicted Baubo. Okay, and now we don't actually know that, but they relate it to the story of Baubo lifting up her skirt for Demeter. Now, it's worth noting that in Europe, there are other of what they call these, like, quote-unquote, obscene female figures that are found. One of the most notable ones is the Sexuality, which you find throughout England, and you find it in Ireland as well. And there's some theories that the Sexuality was a figure that began appearing on churches and in different places around the 11th or 12th century. And one theorist, one of the more popular theories suggests it started in England and it moved its way over to Ireland by the 12th century. Now, and again, there's all kinds of things about what that means. Gig is a Northern English slang for, lady parts. And it's, so there's the idea of it either being connected to a woman who's a hag. Some people try to connect it to the mythology of the Loathly Lady, the sovereignty goddess of the land, which we had talked about last January, actually, when we talked about Dame Ragnell. There's some people that suggest the Sexuality was put there as an exhortation against female lust, or the grotesqueness or sinfulness of female lust in particular. It was noted that in Britain and Ireland, you don't find so many. You don't really seem to be. There are male figures that are quite similar, and they're actually called Chthonia that you find throughout Europe, but they're not. But you don't really see those in so much in the UK or Ireland. So, okay, all that said, as I've seen from scholars, they say the link between Sexuality and these figurines attributed to Baubo is tenuous at best. I mean, we really, there's not the only thing that might be where we might see a similarity or comparison there is in the type of imagery. It's some kind of vulgar female expression of the showing off the female body parts. Okay. In some fashion, these so-called Baubo figurines are connected to, again, you show this face that's by the chin. Okay, that makes the chin and the vulva come together, and the Sexuality, it's generally a woman with her legs spread and she's holding her bits open. So and oftentimes with a very strange facial expression, but it's. But yeah, again, the fact that they both do that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same origin or that they're the same. In fact, it seems highly unlikely that that's the case. Nonetheless, it does make us kind of step back and say, okay, because none of these theories talk about is, what does this image mean? Now, and then of course we run into our next problem, and the problem is that there's also the narrative that Demeter, who was the guest of King Celios in Eleusis, and he refers to the Homeric hymn. There's a reference to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, and then it's Robert Graves who ends up writing Iambe and Baubo personify the obscene songs in iambic meter, which was where I think he's saying Iambe comes from, which were sung to relieve emotional tension at the Eleusinian mysteries, but Iambe, Demeter, and Baubo form the familiar triad of maiden, nymph, and crone. And I can tell you right now, because this is Robert Graves, it is like 90 to 95 to almost 99% sure it's BS, okay? Robert Graves is not really a trustworthy source on literature and folklore. He's more like unfortunately, like a lot of the early writers of, comparative or collective mythology, or especially trying to interpret Greek mythology or mythology of the Mediterranean area, a lot of this stuff he just made up. So, or he made it up to support a certain theory or a certain idea that, that you're trying to shoehorn things into. The maiden mother crone thing, yes, we do see it connected a lot with modern witchcraft and things like that. And, there's, maybe that was part of things, but the idea that this was always this kind of eternal, idea or motif throughout, the symbolism of these myths or of certain things, it's dubious at best. Okay, Robert Graves. Again, when I teach myth theory to my students, we get into the introduction to Graves and his presuppositions, and it becomes very clear pretty quickly why why you need to look at Graves with a very heavy dose of skepticism. So, in any case, so the problem that I think the reason I bring this up as a problem is because, it's really hard to say what exactly, it's hard to say exactly who Baubo, is based on these things. I mean, they're not, her actual true symbolism or what she represents, or even if she was a Greek figure, is also called into question. Now, as I was researching this podcast, I found I could only get the abstract. I wanted to get the actual dissertation to read, but I haven't been able to do that yet. It's an abstract from Frederica Tevebring. I think it's Tevebring. I think that's how you say it. Again, apologies if I'm saying that wrong. And she wrote a dissertation called Unveiling Baubo, the Making of an Ancient Myth. And I'll just read a little bit from the dissertation abstract. It says, Unveiling Baubo describes how the mythical figure Baubo was constructed in 19th century German. Associated with the act of exposing herself to the goddess Demeter, Baubo came to epitomize questions about concealment and unveiling in the budding field of archaeology, philology, psychoanalysis, and literary theory. And as she shows, Baubo did not exist as a coherent mythical figure in antiquity. Rather, the 19th century notion of Baubo was mediated through a disparate array of ancient and contemporary sources centered on the notion of sexual vulgarity. Baubo emerged as a modern amalgam of ancient parts. A myth of a myth invested with the question of what modernity can and should know about ancient Greece. And this is also a good point I've seen in several places, is that you have to remember in Europe at the time, and this is part of the reason that people have an aversion to classical mythology, is that, it's like, Greek culture represented what was aesthetically, proper and approved, or at least set the base standard for, our standards of, ethics, decency, morals, beauty, everything else seem to come from ancient Greece. So the idea that you have these rather vulgar-looking figures, when they're trying to interpret what they are, they're trying to do it in the context of believing in a Greece that represents, in some fashion, all of those, the baseline standard for those values. Okay. She talks about the 1989 excavation of the so-called Baubo statuettes, a group of Hellenistic votive figurines discovered at Prine in modern-day Turkey. The group adheres to a consistent and unique iconography. The face of the female figures is placed directly onto their torso, giving the impression the vulva and chin merge, as we've just said. Based on the statuettes' grotesque, obscene appearance, archaeologists concluded they depicted Baubo, the woman who greeted Demeter at Eleusis when the goddess was searching for her abducted daughter Persephone. According to late church fathers, Demeter refused locals offering of food and drink till Baubo cheered her up by lifting her skirt, exposing herself to the goddess. Hellenistic inscriptions confirm the name Baubo was associated with Demeter in antiquity, but there is no evidence of an association between Baubo and any obscene act in the period preceding these Christian writers, whose reception of Baubo is clearly geared towards exemplifying the vulgarity of pagan traditions. Following the excavation, however, Baubo solidified into an obscene ancient figure described as a grotesque personification of the vulva. As I demonstrate, at the turn to the 20th century, the name Baubo has taken on connotations beyond the ancient sources that mention the name. The mythical figure that the Prine archaeologists recognized in the statuettes have been influenced by a wide range of sources, including Hellenistic statuettes from Egypt, Hapax Legomenon from Herondas, and Goethe's Faust, in which Baubo appears as a witch, figure. Contemporary scholarship has been focused on the question of whether Baubo is properly Greek. The question is continuation of the 19th century debates from which Baubo emerged. Defining Greece was particularly charged in Germany in this century, as ancient Greece came to be held up as a foil for German national identity. As ancient studies came into its own as an academic discipline, German scholars re-examined and often distanced themselves from the idealizing notion of ancient Greek prevalent at the turn of the century. The shifting approach to ancient Greece was both figurative and literal in character, as increased German archaeological activity made the ancient world present in Germany to an unprecedented degree after the 1870s. Okay. Goethe and Nietzsche used Baubo to critique the methods and aims of ancient studies in their respective generations, connecting her obscene act of exposure with the indecent investigations of scholars. Unveiling Baubo describes the processes by which facts about the ancient world are produced. That Baubo's obscenity is still considered an issue that needs to be solved reveals the continued investments in defining ancient Greece. Okay, so this is literally, I've just read the entire abstract to you, which is available from Northwestern University. Okay, so we're seeing this, this discussion of Baubo, and so we have these figurines. They say it looks like a plump woman with her legs held apart, gesturing to her exposed, vulva, a naked splay-legged figure holding a harp on the back of a boar, a naked headless torso with the face and the body and the vulva and the chin of the face, a seated figure with an exaggerated vulva filling the space between the legs, and a naked squatting figure with her hands on her genitalia. Okay, so these are all have been referred to as Baubo figurines, and this is where we end up having the crossover with Chthonia and perhaps other similar figurines of that type. But there is no evidence that they are in fact all the same. Okay, so nonetheless, I think so really this figure of Baubo that we refer to is rather, what's the term? The figure of Baubo is very much, she's definitely associated with this the characteristics there is we have this image of the female genitalia being exposed. Okay, we have this idea sometimes of this being, again, in the Homeric one, this is a maiden who's actually lame, who can't walk. Okay. And in other versions, she's like an old nursemaid or an old hag, is the way, is the implication there. So either way, you're talking about somebody who acts as some kind of a maid or nursemaid for the family. And she's either telling dirty jokes or she's exposing herself. Now, the act of exposing herself, there's some interesting ideas about that, particularly with regard to I found this in some research on just the Chthonia, just looking at what the comparisons were. Now, some people say these figures, that, okay, in one sense, they're regarded as a fertility figure. Okay, that this is, he may mention, with regard to the Chthonia, Barbara Freitag talks about this as being, as being kind of emblematic of some kind of like birthing stones or some kind of fertility ritual. Okay, that seems fairly obvious. The idea of the woman and the female genitalia. There's definitely sort of the almost earth mothery kind of connection there. The idea of fertility of the opening to the womb, right? So now the appearance of things like Chthonia, which again are not the same as they're not the same as Baubo figurines. But if we're talking about them as obscene statuettes of some kind, they were seen by some as these kind of warnings against lust or against female, the sins of the flesh, as it were, because as we've often discussed, things like that kind of raw sexuality were often seen, especially in women in particular, were seen as something, something absolutely grotesque, revolting, and needing to be avoided. Now, we also see this when we've talked. I know I did a podcast where we talked about Marmo, Gello, and Lamia in particular, and I believe that was the one on the Aori that I, discussed those figures as well. And that sort of expands the category to these women these kind of monstrous female figures that are connected either with child stealing, with death of children in childbirth or death of infants. Sometimes all the way up to the idea of a changeling mentality. Again, this child stealing kind of a thing. But if I remember from the Aori podcast, they were often sometimes depicted as hags who not only had maybe either grotesque genitalia or sometimes even had male genitalia as well. There's this very odd connection between this kind of haggish kind of woman who's portrayed as either being very lewd or very monstrous. Okay, and it's a rather interesting image because sometimes it's associated with the older woman. So when you think of the hag, we often think of hag as being associated with barrenness, right? But the hag could also be associated with experience. The woman, not the young virgin maiden, but the woman who has the experience, and perhaps is somewhat perhaps intimidating on that level because of her experience and her abilities in that way. But there's another interesting one too. There's this idea of exposing one's lady parts as a protection against evil. Now, this is with regard to the Shilonagig, but I find this really interesting, like the idea of lifting up your skirt and showing your stuff. They say it served an apotropaic function. That they were kind of like that some of the Shilanagigs in Ireland were called evil eye stones. And there's folkloric evidence of something called sirma, or skirt lifting, being used by women to ward off evil spirits. In fact, there's this wonderful La Fontaine woodcut here, illustrated by Charles Eisen, from 1762, of a devil or a demon approaching a woman, and her lifting up her skirt, and him being horrified, and he's being repulsed. So it's the idea that you can ward off the devil by showing him your genitals. So although those who theorize that this has something to do, at least with the Shilanagigs, I don't know about with the Baubo figures, but it's where in German had suggested that the apotropaic function seems to have been gradually ascribed over time. While this theory may seem to apply to most of the secular and some of the religious figures, it does not apply to all of them. Okay. So, another interesting thing. Now, nobody has said this, by the way, about the Baubo figures. We don't know that they were meant to be, any kind of thing like, to ward off the evil eye or anything else. But it's interesting that belief in connection with the act of showing off one's, parts is somehow connected, especially for women, is somehow connected to warding off evil. Be interesting to know what the rationale might have been behind that. Maybe it's just that if a woman, it could have to do in some senses with the idea of the woman who is more innocent and more easily manipulatable, if that's a word. That the woman who willingly shows off her genitals is somehow more aggressive and more intimidating, and therefore able to fight off those who are, who might take advantage. So I don't know. That's just me making it up. There's literally no theory to support that whatsoever. But that's just just trying to think about what the logic might be behind that. But of course, as we also know, not everything has to have a logic. So okay. So this leads us up to discussions of feminist interpretations of Baubo figures, and again, I know I'm lumping Shilanagigs into a certain degree, even though they are not the same thing. But to me, I'm more interested in this particular image, or the way in which the female genitalia is used in this particular context, in this particular symbolic context. Okay, so that's more what I'm focused on, rather than the fact that no, they're historically not connected to each other. The last piece has a lot, of course, to do with feminist interpretations, and what we'll find with these kinds of figures, where the woman being connected to the vulva, or exposing her genitalia in some way, is it's become like almost a symbol of empowerment, and this. I'll just read this a little bit from this interpretation. Because there's mention here of Judy Chicago's dinner party, Eve Ensler's vagina monologues. So there's, it says feminist scholarship reinterpreted this concept in terms of the image as evil or embodiment of sin. Feminists have adopted the image as an icon, with feminist authors viewing the sexuality of these figures more positively as an empowering figure. The reverence for the female organs, or the vulva, again, they were talking about Judy Chicago, Eve Ensler. In Wide Open to Mirth and Wonder, Luzmar Gonzalez Arias argues that the creative reimagining of this medieval female figure can encourage contemporary women to stop perceiving their own corporality as heavy, awkward, a shameful burden of guilt. Okay, so that's kind of where I want to go with this. Okay, it's not kind of where I want to go. It is where I want to go with this. So, All right, so this leads us to this question here. When you're talking about a figurine that's described as lewd in some fashion, the exaggerating of female genitalia. Now, strictly speaking, when we're talking about what we call obscenity, in terms of what can be publicly displayed, both male and female genitalia are off limits. As far as society is concerned, you're not, although you would see an ancient, you see these kinds of figures just as you would also see Priapus figures and things like that in ancient Rome. Priapus, if you do not know about the story of Priapus and his connection to the goddess Vesta or Hestia, or his attempted connection to the goddess Vesta or Hestia, I recommend looking up Priapus, Priapus, and you can look at the images for yourself. They speak for themselves. But all of these are what you would describe as quote unquote lewd. And it gets me back to a question, and I found myself pondering it again this morning as I was thinking not only about preparing this podcast, but just about other things, other projects and stuff I've been working on. And one of the perennial questions I always come around to, and I apologize if this is getting repetitive a little bit for some of you who listen to this podcast regularly, but it goes back to this idea of blame, where I look at sexuality, blame, and shame. Okay, we live in a society. When I grew up in the, my exposure to culture was largely through the 70s and the 80s. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from. And for me, this, what I remember, the impression that I had, growing up, being a young girl, entering womanhood, which for me, by the way, just happened literally overnight. Like, it was like, or even in the space of like an hour, it was so fast. It's like one day I was playing with dolls, the next day I was an hour later I was interested in boys. I mean, it's so fast, which is one of the reasons I've often tended to look at this, the quote unquote abduction of Persephone, as kind of like, yeah, that's that movement from girlhood to womanhood, and it happens so fast, like you feel like somebody or something's been stolen. It's like hormonally, the shift can happen that fast. Now, I'd be interested, obviously people who follow this on YouTube or my patrons or, even people who comment on the podcasts, I'd be interested to hear if you're, if you're a woman, you identify as, a woman and so forth, you biologically entered that period of your life, what you would feel about that. Like if you feel like that your movement from childhood to adolescence came gradually, or did it come like and hit you like a ton of bricks, or maybe not, maybe there's some modicum in between. But, so, and I think about that and I think, okay, so you enter adolescence. Now what happens when you enter adolescence? You are now a sexual being. You have, in women, that's when your breasts emerge. That's when you start having periods. And, you may grow, your body shape will change, like the kind of straight up and down body shape that we often have. Now some people still retain that, but at other times it's like, the hips expand. It's like they become wider as if they're ready to receive, potentially receive a child. I mean, ostensibly, this is what the body is doing. It's activating the uterus and it's kind of shifting everything around, in preparation for that potential pregnancy, right? Which, of course, is not obviously a necessary conclusion, but that's what the body is doing to itself. And with that comes a whole lot of other stuff that comes along with hormones. Hormones are, they're I don't know, just speaking as a female, they're the bane of my existence. And even now that I have, ceased all those processes, they're still the bane of my existence in some ways. Maybe not as intensely as they used to be. But, and of course, it's not something that's very well understood because, there's not always a whole lot of research and investment in women's health, which is a whole separate subject. But, and by the way, I'm finding this out as I get older and run into certain things and I have doctors going, I don't know, and then when you're doing your own research, realizing that, a lot of this stuff hasn't really been well studied. It's just been written off as, women's hysteria or, being over emotional or something, So there's not necessarily a whole lot of research in what goes into this whole process. in terms of your health and your mental health and everything else. But anyway, just putting that aside, when you hit menarche, when you hit that point, something happens to you, and this is when whatever your desire ends up being, this is when it kicks in. And then now we have a kind of a shift in narrative, because what I grew up with, and I was talking with some friends recently who, around the same age as me, and we think about what we were told growing up. In my family, my mother did not want to talk about these subjects at all. And honestly, it's not a subject I really wanted to talk about with her. I almost felt like there was a sense of shame about it. Like, I'm not a little girl anymore, and what I've become and the way I'm thinking is something I just feel like I can't share with my mother. Like, my mother's it's going to be embarrassing. It's kind of like watching a movie like that and then having like a sex scene appear, and you're sitting there like with your parents and you're like, oh God, it's like, it's just something you don't want to. You don't want to think of your parents as sexual beings, and you don't want them thinking of you as a sexual being. Okay. Maybe it depends on your relationship to your parents. I don't know. But to me, I was just kind of like, no. Even now, like my mother, quick funny story, but I have, as you know, I have novels out, and Maeve, Morrigan timelines, a lot of stuff in Archetype Possession if you read the short story collection, and of course even I've got like 3 new novels, on the, that need to be finished up this year that are on the on deck to be published next. All of them have very highly weird sexual overtones to them for many reasons, or cover some very, very taboo subjects, or even in sometimes in very horrific ways, because that's just how my imagination works. And, that again, it's a set. I'm not going to digress into why that is, but in any case, after my father passed away, my mother, at Christmas time this year, I said to her, well, what do you want? What do you want for Christmas? She goes, I want to read your books. And I was like, no, you don't. Of course, naturally, I got her a copy of Death and the Maiden. I said, like I said, that's a really dense read. If you want to try to wade through it, best of luck to you. It's dense because this is not, she's not someone who's kind of immersed in this topic. If she was, she'd probably get a lot more out of it. But in any case, she says, well, I want to read your fiction. And I'm like, I don't want you to read my fiction because I don't want you to think of me as having those kind of thoughts. So it's just funny. It's just one of those things that we have with our parents. But in any case, the whole narrative growing up, when you fall in love with somebody for the first time, when you have sex with somebody for the first time. And okay, now legally speaking, nobody's supposed to have sex before the age of 18. Okay. And many of us, I know very few people who waited until they were 18 or older, or till they were married to have sex. Okay? A lot of people have sex around like the age of 16, sometimes 15. It's not that uncommon. And as I've noted, it's like, okay, one of the things I see in articles is about the rock stars of the past. The rock legends who always had all these female groupies, most of them under 18. In fact, if you read Pamela DeBar's book, I'm with the band, by the time you were 18, you were considered to be quote unquote an old hag. So, and not by the rock stars necessarily, by the way, just amongst other groupies. I mean, that's what they saw you as. You're 18 now, you're too old. And it's a rather interesting dynamic, and some people are horrified by it. If you're somebody with children or with female children, especially the men are like, no, nobody's going to touch my daughter in that way. So there's this narrative here of the girl who has to be kept innocent. And if the girl doesn't remain quote unquote innocent, okay, if she does get involved in something, or if she does in any way kind of flagrantly show off her sexuality, she's almost portrayed as monstrous. She's they have all the words, the horrible word, whore, slut, all these words that they have for women who are, who are perceived as promiscuous. And the woman may not even be promiscuous. She may have just met a guy. Her hormones are absolutely raging out of control, and she may have just been like completely drawn in and been like, yeah, I'm into it. Okay. There may not have been a thought about what consequences might be or whatever else. But I grew up and there were situations in my neighborhood and in areas where there were girls who were, say, I'm thinking of one particular case where the girl was 13 and the guy was like 16. And she was immediately hustled off to a convent by her parents, and of course the baby was taken and put up for adoption. But she was a disgrace to the family. She was viewed as a whore. She was not somebody to talk to, and she was apparently like, and the girl was devastated on every level. I think it completely ruined her. But she was like more or less told, like, she was just treated like such a disappointment to her family, right? Now the guy in question, basically his family did nothing about it. It was just kind of like, boys will be boys, they're going to play around. And that was always sort of the narrative there, and I remember growing up and there was all kinds of ideas among guys who were under 18 about, what it was like to have, they have all kinds of, not even myth. They're like absolute pure fiction about, women and what they look like and what they're going to be like in bed and this kind of stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. And there's all kinds of talk. I mean, women have a lot of, stupid ideas about that kind of stuff too. I remember some of the ideas that were floated like between the 6th and 8th grades, and I'm like, what? I'm not going to mention them here because I don't need my podcast banned by YouTube. But in any case, there's just some very, very odd ideas that are out there. And what I've noticed is that the shift in narrative, it's gone from being about, the girl who's the temptress. Although, no, I shouldn't say that. I should correct myself there. That narrative has not entirely shifted. You do see it in things like abstinence education and things like that, where they'll say, she's dressed a certain way and she's doing this and that, like blaming the victim, blaming the woman, basically. And trying to say that she is the one who's leading him on. You see, it's not his fault. He can't help himself, but, she's leading him on. Okay, so that's one version of the narrative. The other version of the narrative, which is kind of the Me Too version, is the one that says that, no, the man, especially if you're talking about an older man, and I say older, I don't mean like 60 years old, and you're talking a 13-year-old. I mean like, let's just say the guy's 18 or 19 and like say she's 14 or 15, something like that. Okay. Where he's legally an adult and she's not. Okay. That's the point. Or guys in their 20s liking these teenage girls. Like, again, these rock stars, back in the 70s, probably the 60s. Also, there was this kind of culture of that. Now the narrative is, no, the men are the monsters here and the women are innocent. They've been violated. They've been groomed. Groomed is a word that's used a lot. These guys are pedophiles. And it's funny. People try to use the term pedophile for any relationship where a man is much older and a woman is much younger. So if, let's just say, two people are married, let's just say one is 40 and the other is, 25. Then people still kind of treat it the same way. Like it's he's a pervert going after little girls. It's like, no, I mean, and I guess there's sort of an equivalent when they talk about the woman who's the cougar, right? The older woman who's going after the younger men. And all of these things are ridiculous because the numbers game is a stupid one. Even the idea of that at 18 that you are now a fully cognizant, responsible adult who knows how to make decisions is ridiculous. I mean, I've taught college for years. I mean, and I know that, yes, you do have some students who are very mature and, can do this stuff. And then you have others who it's just kind of like they, you're wondering how they dress themselves in the morning. And it doesn't really make any difference. If you're talking neurologically or biologically, your frontal lobes don't really finish developing until you're about 22 or 23 years old. And this is, and before that, your faculties in the brain for assessing risk assessment are not that great. So if you want to go by biology, then strictly speaking, nobody should be allowed to have sex until they're at least 22 or 23, which, it seems ridiculous, but there's this numbers game that goes on, but the bottom line is this. We've taken the narrative and shifted it from, not entirely, this is kind of a gray area, but the prevailing narrative has gone from, boy who's player and girl who is loose to girl who is innocent victim and boy who is predator. Okay? That's what we flipped it into. And both narratives are a big problem because they both play the same shame and blame game. Yes, that all rhymed. It's the idea that dealing with your sexuality is somehow shameful. A friend of mine who was over a couple weeks ago had said to me, yeah, she says when she grew up, when they became teenagers, they would say to her brother, well, if you do decide to go out and do anything, make sure you're careful, use protection, da-da-da. And with her, it was, no, you're not doing anything at all. So there's this shutting down of female sexuality, which leads to the idea, if you believe all of the hype and spin about all the horrible things that are going to happen to you if you have sex, to try to stem the tide of hormones, then sex becomes something. It becomes something bad in your mind. It becomes something dangerous, something to be feared, and something to be avoided. I remember doing a paper on, certain Catholic and Protestant influences in Ireland for grad school. And one of the things that came out of it that the Protestants were very critical of the Catholics for was that the Catholic educators had gotten the both men and the women, or the girls and the boys, so terrified of sex and what could happen to them if they have sex, but that their population dropped by 30% at one point, because everybody was going into church, going into convents, because they were so afraid of what was going to happen to their soul or to whatever else if they dared to get pregnant. Speaking of, I remember somebody did tell me, who I was staying with in Ireland, said, what would happen is if you had a girl who got pregnant out of wedlock in Ireland, she would be, quote unquote, sent to tend to her sick aunt, and then would kind of disappear, and then the child would be put up for adoption. We also know things about the Magdalene laundries and stuff like that. There's this definite attempt to deal with budding sexuality by basically, stomping your foot down on it and saying, no, we're going to, you don't want to totally snuff it out, because obviously society wants people to engage in relationships when they're adults. And of course, again, depending on how conservative you are, only within certain things, for example, the confines of marriage or something like that. But, it's more socially acceptable now to not be married. But, there's this idea of adulthood, the idea of teenage girls or, having a sexuality, or what they should do with that sexuality is like incredibly, like if you're talking about a hot button topic, I mean, that one's like on fire and will melt your face off. That's an intense topic that, even if you try to have discussions around it, people immediately, even people who are open to different ideas about the feminine, want to shut that discussion down immediately. And I've noticed it many, many times. And I'm like, listen, this is not a discussion of whether or not teenage girls should legally be allowed to have sex. Okay. I do have a problem, as I've said before, with the idea of statutory or sex offender laws that register a man as a sex offender for life when in cases where of statutory rape. So, for instance, if you have an 18-year-old guy with a 17-year-old girlfriend and they're having sex, if they're caught or something happens, he registered as a sex offender for life. Now, I don't know anybody who thinks that that's okay. How do you approach sexuality in a way that portrays it as healthy? Because sexuality isn't something that is, we treat it as something dangerous and we treat it as something shameful. We have not gotten rid of that. And the way that the narratives have changed, even with the expansion of, say, gender definitions and, more people becoming non-binary and more accepting of, relationships that are not now defined as cisgender, it hasn't changed the underlying narrative. And so I point back to images like the Baubo image, the way in which we react to female sexuality when we're approached with it. And all of these kinds of things that are either they makes them either lewd, or and the controversial way of trying to think about it as somehow something that is uncomfortable, something that in Demeter's case that makes her laugh. But the way that the church points to this and says, see, look at this shamelessness. Now, if there is an origin to these, like if the presence of these figurines and of these different things, both male and female, is an indication here of a much more, robust or accepted view of sexuality and its presence and the power of it. That we don't know, but it's certainly interesting to think about. And I feel that, when we're dealing with those kinds of forces that are represented by these kinds of figures and images, rather than turning them into monsters, which is basically what we do in society as people are growing up, and now it's kind of this quote-unquote monster that you don't know how to deal with. Instead, there needs to be a sort of respect for the power that comes out of that. There's got to be respect for the power of sex and sexuality, because the energy, the hormonal energy that goes on there is intense. I mean, even forget about even having sex. I mean, it's just an intensely powerful energy. And both at the beginning of the process and towards the end of it. I mean, it does explode, there's explosive things. If you happen to be somebody who believes in poltergeist activity, what parapsychologists theorize is that this tends to happen around adolescence because, the kind of hormonal stuff that's being given off at that time, the theory is that it's so powerful that it actually can move stuff in the environment and take the internal emotional energy and somehow direct it outwards. Now, whether you think that's true or not, I mean, there's a testament there to the power of what's going on there. And the way we have no rituals, we have no initiations, we have there's no rites of passage that effectively allow us to deal with this. We just deal with it, flying by the seat of our pants very awkwardly and in a way that in the end, makes relationships of any variety, that are of a sexual nature, very, very problematic and very difficult. We grow up with all kinds of hangups and neuroses about sex and about, either we're, people who are overly interested in sex or feel that they're overly defined by sex, or constant needing attention in that way because they feel that somehow that's what defines them, or the reverse, I hate all men and, they're all terrible. And, there's all kinds of permutations of what happens because of the traumas inflicted at this time, which we as a society have absolutely no clue how to handle at all. It's either we've just basically taken, the most progressive views have taken the blame and shifted it from one side to the other. And that doesn't really help anything. So anyway, I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've been talking for an hour, and ridiculously easy for me to do, as we all know. But I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please check out all my work at Chthonia.net. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/Chthonia. I feel like now I'm creating more stuff, and I'm hoping to have some more interesting extra episodes and stuff there, not just one a month. I'd like to be able to start doing, ideally I'd love to do one a week. I realize that's not always feasible, but I definitely want to increase the output to patrons here. And I want to say thank you, of course, to the patrons who have been very supportive of me through this whole thing. Everybody there is very wonderful, very supportive. And, and I'm glad that you're on board with me and that you stick with me in spite of the fact that, I feel like I'm trying to move ahead with stuff and running into brick walls all the time. But hopefully that's something, that's going to be less of an issue going forward. So if you want to follow me on social media, it's Chthonia Podcast, one word on Instagram and Twitter, 2 words on Facebook, and I'm just Chthonia on YouTube. Thanks so much for listening, and until the next episode.